Hello, fellow chess players. Today we are going to look at how to play positions with an isolated pawn. So as we can see, a pawn that has no friends, all of the pawns around him have been eaten, so now he's isolated. So before I show you some practical games that will explain how to play this position from both sides, leave a like, subscribe, and here we go. Okay, so before I actually show you those games, I'd like just to make a little precision. We're going to look specifically at isolated queen's pawn, so this pawn. Why? Because it's actually an isolated pawn you'll see the most of the time. Like let's say in this position in QGA, in Queen's Gambit accepted, Black will attack the center with the pawn C, and then Black will take. And so this is a really typical position. We are going to see it with some variations down the line, for sure. So one can say it's a weakness because actually, even though it takes some important squares, it's just isolated. It can't be protected by other pawns. Black will just eat it. But also, it can be a strength of White's position, as I have already mentioned. Takes very, very important squares where knights will be able to go, and also gives a lot of activity and space for white pieces. Because here, Black's bishop, white squared bishop, is blocked by his pawn, while our pawn is a little bit further, and white has a lot of activity going on. However, normally if black is just able to win the pawn, it will be over. So it's going to be a little of a race if white is able to develop its initiative, or else if white doesn't do it in time, black will just win the pawn. But it will be a lot clearer with examples I'm going to show you. So, the first game I'll show you is Karpov Anatoly, the former world champion, known for his very positional approach, very like right approach. He doesn't make any flashy moves, he just does good moves that upgrade the position by a little bit. And a person like that will really fancy playing against an isolated pawn. Why? Because it's a weakness, and you just upgrade your pieces one by one. So that's what he does. He castles. He puts the rook on an open file. Nothing spectacular for now. And here, after bishop d6, he goes to accomplish a three-step plan. You're going to do two. Okay, so the first step of the plan is actually to block the pawn. We'll see what happens if you don't do it. But actually, it's really preferable to block weaknesses of the opponent, as they won't be able to move anymore, and as such they will be easier targets. Static targets also are always easier than moving ones. So here I don't know if it's actually possible to guess his move because it's very, very strong. But it's a very, very sneaky bishop e2. Why? Because actually the piece we are going to use usually is a knight to block the pawn. Because there is one pawn or one knight that's already eyeing the pawn, already eyeing this sweet d4 square it wants to go to. And the other one will be able to go here as such. So the first plan here, the first stage of the plan is completed, as now the black pawn won't be able to move anymore. And here he comes to the second stage of the plan, which is really important. So it's a weakness, but it's also a strength because it gives a platform for black to attack. It gives a lot of space that black can use to coordinate its pieces in order to attack. So white is going to exchange some pieces. I can't give you exact guidelines on what pieces to exchange, but always, kinda always, you have to exchange queens. And I like leaving like a rook and a minor piece, a rook and a knight, or a bishop. So what he's going to do is to solidify a position. He is going to exchange some pieces, like here, for example. And he is going to exchange a pair of rooks. So now position of white is not dangerous at all. He has no major weaknesses, and his weak king can't be exploited because black just simply doesn't have enough pieces. You have to get a little bit more than that. Like for example, a bishop, and then you'll be able to play h4, h5, h5, h4, but now it's just too slow. So Joel tries changing the pawn structure, but it doesn't work because this pawn is weak. If he's able to do this in order to protect the pawn, maybe the game will be drawn. But here you can make a pause if you want to. And the move Karpov made here, very strong move, is g4 in order to just crush Lothier dreams of establishing this lifeline for a pawn with a5. So black tried played for a little bit more, but Karpov's technique is flawless. He just takes a little bit more space on the queen side. He activates his king. We are going to have a lesson on endgames also, but it's not the purpose of today's lesson. And he just beats him slowly but surely. It's usually the kind of win you can have in the isolated pawn structures, because an opponent has only one minor weakness, and you have to be patient in order to beat him. So, okay, a very, very long rook endgame. I'm trying to make it for you like a movie where you can just relax and watch. And here, the pawn is going to promote. So, Joel actually had to resign the game. And now, let's go to the second game. Once again by Anatoly Karpov, because he's a very positional type of player who likes attacking small weaknesses one by one. So the same thing, kind of. Some kind of Queen's Gambit accepted. And now it's white who has an isolated pawn. And basically black will do the same thing. Very, very beautiful. Typical resource. The idea is that once again, if he goes here, we'll just take and we'll have a two bishops advantage. Like here, black just better. Some doubled pawns, isolated pawn, and also bishops are going to go into the attack. So, Koshnoi, very, very strong player also, by the way, has to take. And here, basically, black is already a little bit better. Just like that. Because the first stage of the plan is completed now. The pawn is blocked. The second will be completed. He'll exchange some pieces, like here, for example. Here, for example. He exchanges a couple of pieces. And if he exchanges one couple of rooks more, he will just be better. He will just have a comfortable advantage. Because, once again, the isolated pawn gives space. If you have a huge room, it's good if you have like 100 people reception. But there is no use for a huge room when there is like 5 people and a cat. So exchanges pieces to prevent counterplay associated with the pawn and all of the inside attacks. And the third part of the plan is just to attack the pawn direct to win it. Here, Korchnoi played rook c3, which is more of a bad idea. However, an interesting idea is rook c6, and I'll leave you once again some time to establish with what piece you're going to take here. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. If you took with the knight, you'd be wrong, because actually you have to block the pawn always. Otherwise, it's just going to break free and you have to exchange. And this position is even worse for black because bishop likes playing on both sides. Knight is a little bit more slow. Okay, so he'd take with a pawn, I think. For me, it's just a very, very logical idea, but we will never know. I don't have, unfortunately, contacts with Karpov. Unfortunately. Okay, so rook c3, queen d6, and now just the main idea of black, blocking the pawn once again. Up. 95, nice and tight, and just upgrading pieces by a bit. And the problem with the isolated pawn that you have to really go into the passive defense, and we can use our pawn to attack. That's what he did afterwards, gaining a little bit of space on the queen side. Karpov is really known for like steady encroaches like that. He doesn't go right away. He just slowly, slowly upgrades his position, and one time when he's ready, he's just going to push and take. But only when he's absolutely ready. And now his queen is activated. His rook is on the second rank, and very, very sad story for Kochny, actually. He had to resign because if he goes here, there's just like rook d1 and bye bye white queen. Okay, so by now you might be thinking, okay, so I have to really avoid isolated pawn positions as it's a weakness. The opponent is going to block it, and then he's just going to exchange all the pieces to avoid counterplay, and then he'll just like take it. But it's not always the case. I mean, when you play against Karpov, that's the likely thing that will happen. But actually, it's not that clear. Let's take a game from a more of a attacking and interesting player, like Shakria Mamedyarov was white, against a fellow grandmaster, Andrei Harlov, which is a little bit weaker maybe than Shakriar, but still a very, very solid player. And here, the famous structure. We have seen the same position, but with a4 instead of bishop b3, if you remember. And here, Shakria is going to unleash all of his fury on poor guy. Like here, maybe hmm, knight d5 maybe is not the best, but maybe I would have played like knight b4 or something else in order to block the pawn already. Because here you can't actually sustainably block the pawn. You have to make a move afterwards. Like let's say knight b4, and then actually with something like a3, and when the knight goes back, you can take here, and you change the pawn structure, and white will have small edge because of the activities. Like he's going to put the rook here, and maybe press slightly. Nothing extraordinary, or maybe play h3 to avoid bishop g4. Nothing extraordinary, but white will be maybe a little bit better. Also, white will take the e5 square, and then maybe play that, so it's really dangerous. Here just tactically it doesn't work. So he has to take, and here there is one knight instead of two, and it makes a huge, huge difference. Harlov won't be able to block this pawn as easily. And also, knight isn't here, queen goes here, and it quickly degenerates. You have to normally have two knights. One protects the king side from the attacks, and the other one is on d5 blocking the pawn. However, there is only one knight for Harlov, and that will just allow Shakria to go in. This is a very, very typical sacrifice, by the way. You have to be on the lookout for it all the time. And even more stylish, knight f7 is typical. It can be seen in a lot of isolated pawn games. However, rook f6 is quite a beautiful move. And here you just take on f6, you take on f7, and the king has to go away. Otherwise, you just lose your queen on a discover check. Then the 8th rank is very, very weak. So black has to exchange one rook, otherwise he's in a pretty rough spot. So white just takes, and Harlow in a seemingly equal position resigns, because it's not equal at all, actually. White has rook, bishop, and 2 pawns for the queen, which is by itself maybe a small advantage, but not that much. However, just look at this rook at the 7th rank. It's absolutely hilarious how it attacks everything. Also, it will get joined by the bishop, and poor black king is going to get mated, probably. Also, there is a very nasty passed pawn that will be able to promote one day, probably. Okay, if you're more a positional player and you don't want to go in an all-out attack, you kind of have to when you have the isolated pawn. That's basically what is the strong suit of your position. However, there is a little bit less fun way to convert the isolated pawn into an advantage. Like here, Peter Swidler makes maybe all the right moves. However, he doesn't actually protect and block the pawn that well. Like, he makes all the good moves, like this maneuver we have already seen to block the pawn, but it's not quite enough because his development is a little bit sloppy. And so here, bishop b4, it might seem that black has accomplished its objectives completely. He blocked the pawn. He's going to exchange some pieces now, maybe. White doesn't seem to have a very, very strong attack neither. But actually, the rook goes here. Like, we benefit from this advanced pawn. And tactically, when the knight isn't there, so it's unblocked, we can just push d5 by force, because there is a little vis-a-vis, a little standout between the bishops. And so when the dust settles, after all of those fascinating tactics I'm not going to go into, it would be just an hour long video and I want to avoid it. And after all of that, after all of those beautiful tactics, David Navarra is just winning, because he exchanged his pawn, and normally when you have an isolated pawn, you have more space, so you can put your pieces on better positions. And so when the pawn goes off, your pieces are more prepared for the tactical battle that ensues. So here, the pawns that were very weak, the king is weak, and Svida tried playing for a little bit, but it already kinda drove. Queen takes, queen here, rook c1, very, very solidly. Very good conversion technique from Navarra. And knight f6 attacks the rook, and a little beautiful, beautiful tactic here. So you can't actually take here, because I imagine knight h5, and then you're just getting mated. So Svidle resigned. So very, very beautiful method. Instead of going into an all-out attack, you just push d5, you benefit from the space gained in a different way. Instead of just attacking, you use that space to place pieces carefully on better positions than your opponent, and then you just push the pawn. Yeah, so one more example. Actually, one example might have been enough, but I just like this game very, very much. Kasparov against Ivanchuk, two legends, two absolute chess legends, playing in Linares 1999. So I guess Ivanchuk was top 5 at the moment. And here, the same opening we have already seen. And Kasparov, as an aggressive player he is opting for this isolated pawn. As such, he will be able to play actively and creatively in his style. So the rook goes on e1, possibly preparing knight e5 in one way or another. So black castles, white does this really sneaky move a3 in order to make knight b4 impossible. And so this maneuver is not available anymore. So Ivanchuk tries attacking the bishop in another way and gaining some space on the queen side. However, it doesn't quite work because of d5. And actually, you may be puzzled why he just doesn't take. It doesn't work because now white gave away his pawn, his isolated pawn, but he's just better because that isolated pawn let white regroup in such a way that his piece is absolutely monstrous. He's just going to mate Ivanchuk at one point. So that's why I guess Ivanchuk didn't take. Instead, he opted for knight c4, which is not a very good move actually, because of quite the same idea. Queen d3, bishop g4, bishop g5, and moreover, its knight is getting attacked indirectly, but attacked. And here we can see that now. That's why I like this game so much. The roles have reversed. Now it's black who has the isolated pawn instead of white who was having it just a little bit earlier. However, white actually was able to use the fact that they had the isolated pawn to gain some space to regroup their pieces. And now, even though it's black who has an isolated pawn, it's white pieces who actually matter instead of the usual. And then he just proceeds to do the normal plan by blocking the pawn. Then he's going just to avoid counterplay by blocking all of the essential squares that you have to have with black to get counterplay. Knight a4, grading pieces by a bit, then exchanging everything. And it's actually quite stunning because Kasparov usually engages in some tactical, serious chess with sacrifices. However, here he has to play like Karpov a little bit, exchanging everything, making his advantage a little bit bigger and bigger every move. Here it was played in a time scramble, so maybe the moves aren't the best. For example, here he just misses the fact that he can't take. He should have played bishop c5 instead. So maybe it wasn't the best conversion. He might have played better in the endgame, but altogether, very, very impressive example of how even if you are Garry Kasparov, you have to play patiently. You have to attack the isolated pawn one by one and to exchange pieces. Even though usually he likes to leave the queens on the board, when you play against the isolated pawn, you have to exchange them. And afterwards, he won the same game quite easily. And just to add on a neutral example, on a recent game, have a look at this game between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Dean Liren at the 2023 World Championship, where it wasn't quite typical as a little pawn, but there is a maneuver I wanted to highlight here. So c6, for now it's a Carlsbad structure. So basically now white has a choice between between knight f3 and then pushing a3 b4 minority attack. And what he played here is playing with knight e2, and then he's going to take the center. However, what is quite efficient here is black against such an idea. Here, notice knight h5, which is a typical move. So what is very strong with black against such an idea of pushing e4 is c5, because you have the same isolated pawn here, but if he takes, obviously. But the pawn e3 is going to be weak, and that's what he is going to demonstrate in the game for some time. So queen d2, and here A very, very beautiful idea. Here I leave you some time once again to choose with what piece you're taking. 3, 2, 1. And if you took with the rook, it would be quite a logical idea. However, knight takes stronger. Why? Because for tactical reasons, you can't really take here. Here the king is going to be very weak. And if you take with the knight, there is just knight b6 and you lose a piece. So, very, very sharp idea. But why is the knight better here than here? As I mentioned it already, the pawn actually takes those two squares, very important squares. And so knight would really like to go here. But he can't. There is a pawn. Of course, that's a major trade-off. You don't have this square, but you have a major pawn weakness. And now Dean is going to exploit it. He's going to go here on the other square that's given by the isolated pawn. But the position is still equal because Jan knows what to do. He blocks. Dean upgrades his pieces. And as such, as both players played rather well, applying all of the principles, like Dean upgrading his pieces carefully uh, and creating activity, because he has the isolated pawn, he can create activity. And Jan here blocking the pawn as such as it can't move, and the game ends in a draw. To sum up, when you play against an isolated pawn, you first block it, then you exchange some pieces to exclude counterplay possibilities for your opponent, and then you attack and hit it. And when you play with the isolated pawn, you can either attack your opponent and sacrifice pieces and mate, and if you're a little bit calmer, can just push it to exchange it and have better displacement as a result. And last but not the least, you can also move your knights to c4 and e4 just to stabilize the position, and it's going to be a draw. So, hope you like this video. Hope you found it useful as well. If that's the case, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, apply those principles to get better at chess.